My name is Tom Miles, and I've been driving trucks for more than 15 years. I'm used to the roads, the late hours, the long stretches of highway with no other cars in sight. I've driven in all sorts of weather, through mountains, flatlands, and endless stretches of forest. I thought I'd seen it all, but there's one night I'll never forget, one night that still haunts me. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was just leaving a small town after finishing a drop-off. My eyes felt heavy, and all I wanted was to get back on the main highway, finish my miles, and maybe find a spot to rest. But the road back was long, and I didn't want to waste time. That's when I saw the sign for the old road. The sign was rusty, barely hanging onto the post. It read Maple Hollow Road. I remembered that road. It was a shortcut I'd taken once years ago. It was supposed to save about 30 minutes, which would get me back to the main highway faster. I didn't think twice. I turned the truck onto the narrow road, feeling confident. At first, it was like any other country road, trees on both sides, their branches stretching over the road like a tunnel. But the farther I drove, the darker it seemed to get. The moonlight barely made it through the thick branches. My headlights were the only light, and even then, the shadows seemed to twist and move on their own. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But a strange feeling settled in my gut, a sense that I was being watched. I laughed it off, thinking, "Come on, Tom, it's just an old road." But soon, the road started to get rougher. Potholes and cracks made the truck rattle, and I had to slow down. The trees seemed to grow thicker, pressing in from both sides. It was so quiet, too. Normally, you'd hear the sounds of crickets, maybe an owl, or even the rustle of leaves. But that night, it was silent. So silent that I could hear my own breathing and the hum of the engine like it was the only sound in the world. I was about 15 minutes in when I saw something up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as I got closer, I saw it more clearly, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop. My heart pounded as I stared through the windshield. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. It was a woman. She wore an old-fashioned dress, one of those long white ones you'd see in a movie. Her hair was dark and wild, hanging around her face like she hadn't brushed it in years. I rolled down my window a bit, just enough to speak. "Hey, do you need help?" I called out. She didn't answer, didn't even blink. She just kept staring at me with these empty, dark eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought about backing up, but the road was too narrow, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck. So, I tried again. "Ma'am, are you okay?" She lifted her arm and pointed down the road as if she wanted me to keep going. Her finger was thin and pale, almost like it was made of bone. I didn't know what else to do, so I nodded, rolled up my window, and slowly started driving again. As I passed her, I kept my eyes straight ahead, but I could feel her gaze following me. Even after I drove past her, I felt like she was still watching me. A few minutes later, I glanced in my mirror. She was gone. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe it was just a strange encounter with some local. But the further I drove, the more unsettled I felt. Then, I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, just like before, staring at me. I hit the brakes, my heart racing. This time, she was closer, close enough that I could see her face clearly. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were empty, like they had no color at all. I was too scared to roll down the window this time. I just stared back, gripping the wheel tightly. She lifted her arm again and pointed down the road. Her finger shook slightly, as if she was struggling to hold it up. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to turn around and get out of there, but the road was too narrow and I had no way to turn my truck around. So, I did the only thing I could. I drove forward, passing her again, feeling her eyes burn into me as I went by. This time, I didn't look back. I kept my eyes straight ahead, focusing on the road, trying to ignore the fear building inside me. But then, I saw something else, something worse. A shadow appeared on the road in front of me. It was her again, only now she was lying in the middle of the road, her body twisted in a way that didn't look natural, like her bones were broken. I stopped the truck, my hands shaking. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I thought maybe I was dreaming, maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel, but the scene in front of me was all too real. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to get out of this place. So I took a deep breath, gripped the wheel, and slowly started driving forward. As I approached her, her body started to move. She lifted her head, her eyes empty and dark, staring right at me. Then, she opened her mouth, but no sound came out. It was like she was trying to scream, but her voice was gone. I floored the gas, speeding past her. I didn't care about the potholes or the cracks in the road. I just wanted to get out of there. As I sped down the road, I saw her again and again. Each time she looked more twisted, more broken. Her face grew more hollow, her eyes darker, until she barely looked human. Finally, I saw a light up ahead, a small cabin at the end of the road. I didn't care who was inside, I just wanted to get away from her. I pulled up, parked the truck, and ran to the cabin, banging on the door. An old man answered, looking at me with wide eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked. I told him everything, the woman, the pointing, her twisted body on the road. His face grew pale and he shook his head. "You took the old road, didn't you?" he said. "People around here know better than to take that road after dark. She was killed on that road years ago. They say her spirit haunts it, looking for someone to take her place." I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in his eyes told me he was telling the truth. I spent the night in his cabin, too scared to go back to my truck. When the sun finally rose, I made my way back to my truck. The road looked different in the daylight, quiet, empty, just an old country road. There was no sign of the woman, no sign of anything strange. I got back on the main highway and I never took that road again. I still drive trucks, but I avoid Maple Hollow Road. Some things are better left alone, and that road? It's one of them. I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years, driving back and forth across the country, moving through long stretches of empty highways and quiet sleeping towns. You'd think after all that time I'd seen everything there is to see on the road. Truth is, I've seen things I don't ever talk about, things that don't make sense, things that keep me up at night, even now, years after they happened. This is one of those stories. It was a little past midnight and I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Texas. I'd been driving for hours, just me, my rig, and the open road. My headlights were the only light for miles around, and the radio barely picked up a signal. The static was almost soothing, breaking up the silence. I wasn't due for another stop until dawn, but the coffee was wearing off, and I could feel the weariness creeping in. I kept rolling the windows down, letting in blasts of cold air to keep myself awake. The night was pitch black, and the road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon, disappearing into the dark. Every now and then, a shape in the distance would trick me into thinking I saw something, but it would always turn out to be a shadow or the trick of the headlights. You get used to it out here. But then I saw something that didn't look like a shadow. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as I got closer, I could make out the figure of a person standing on the side of the road, waving. My heart skipped a beat. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, especially not in the middle of the night, but something about this felt different. She looked desperate. Her clothes were torn, and her face had this haunted look, like she'd been through hell and back. Against every bit of common sense, I slowed down and pulled over, the engine rumbling as I came to a stop. She climbed up into the cab without a word, her movements slow, like she was exhausted. She had long, dark hair, tangled and matted, and her skin was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. She looked over at me and muttered, "Thank you," in a voice so soft I barely heard it. "No problem," I said, trying to sound calm, though my nerves were already on edge. "Where you headed?" She didn't answer, just stared out the window, her eyes fixed on something far off in the distance. I tried again, asking if she was all right, but she only nodded, still not saying a word. After a few minutes, a strange smell started to fill the cab. It was subtle at first, like the damp, musty smell of old leaves, but it kept getting stronger until it was almost unbearable. I figured it was coming from her clothes. She looked like she'd been out there for days. But something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just musty, it was sour, like rot. I wanted to open a window, but I didn't want to be rude. I stole a glance at her, hoping to make conversation, but when I looked at her face, my heart skipped a beat. Her skin looked even paler than before, almost gray in the dim light, and her eyes were dark and empty, like she was staring right through me. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. "Where are you from?" I asked, trying to break the silence, but she didn't respond. I was starting to feel uneasy, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, my knuckles turning white. The road stretched out ahead of us, an endless line cutting through the darkness, and I kept hoping we'd come across a gas station or somewhere I could drop her off. Then, I noticed she was whispering. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but I leaned in, and I could hear her voice so faint I could barely make out the words. "He's still out there. He's still out there." She kept saying over and over. A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Who's out there?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, but she didn't answer. She just kept staring out the window, her eyes unfocused, like she was seeing something I couldn't see. I looked back at the road, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was building inside me. The night was silent except for the hum of the engine, and every now and then, the radio would crackle, as if trying to pick up a signal. I turned the volume down, the static only adding to the tension in the air. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road, right in my headlights. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his face hidden in shadow. I barely had time to react. I slammed on the brakes, swerving to avoid him, and the truck skidded off to the side, coming to a jarring stop in the ditch. My heart was pounding as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. I looked around, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The road was empty, stretching out into the darkness, and there was no one there. I turned to the passenger seat, ready to ask the woman what she knew about the man, but she was gone. The seat was empty, the door still shut. I looked around, trying to figure out where she could have gone, but there was no trace of her. I got out of the truck, shining my flashlight around, but the night was silent and still. There was no sign of her, no footprints, nothing. It was like she'd never been there at all. I climbed back into the cab, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something written in the dust on the dashboard. "Thank you." Just those two words, scrawled in thin, spidery letters, like someone had traced them with a finger. I stared at it, my mind racing, but I didn't know what to think. I started the engine, my heart pounding as I pulled back onto the road, my eyes scanning the darkness, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, expecting to see her sitting there, but the cab was empty, the silence almost deafening. When I finally reached my destination, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the empty road. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if she was real or if I imagined the whole thing, but every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I feel a chill, like she's still out there, waiting for the next driver to come along. And every now and then, when I'm driving alone at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, a figure standing by the side of the road, waving. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe she's still out there, looking for someone to take her home. I was on my usual route, running an overnight haul through the mountains, miles from anywhere. The clock read past midnight, and I'd been on the road so long it felt like the lines were starting to blur. That night was particularly dark, with thick clouds hiding any trace of moonlight. My radio had cut out hours ago, leaving me alone with the low hum of the engine and the empty stretch of road winding through endless trees. Just as I was about to take a sip of stale coffee, something caught my eye up ahead, a figure, standing on the side of the road, just barely within reach of my headlights. It was a man, tall and thin, with his thumb out, hitching for a ride. He was wearing a dark, heavy coat that hung loosely around his frame, and his face was hidden under the shadow of a hood. Now, any other night, I'd have driven right on past. I wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not in the middle of the night. But something about the way he stood there, so still, like he was waiting just for me, made me ease my foot off the pedal. I pulled up next to him and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" Without a word, he nodded and opened the door, sliding into the passenger seat. He settled in, not saying a single word or even glancing my way. I was about to ask where he was headed, but a strange feeling came over me, a heavy, unsettling quiet that filled the cab the second he closed the door. I shrugged it off and started driving again, figuring he'd speak up sooner or later. But the miles passed in silence. The guy just sat there, stiff as a board, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood, staring straight ahead. I kept sneaking glances at him, trying to make out his face, but the darkness seemed to cling to him like fog. All I could see were his eyes, staring out from under the hood, cold and empty, like two dark pits that went on forever. After a while, the silence got to me. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Nothing. He didn't even turn his head, just kept staring ahead, his eyes fixed on the road like he was seeing something far off in the distance. I tried again, but he didn't so much as blink. I started feeling uneasy, like there was a weight pressing down on my chest. The air in the cab felt colder, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was about to pull over and tell him to get out when he finally spoke, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't used it in years. "They never stop," he muttered, almost to himself. "What?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. "They never stop for me," he repeated, a little louder this time, but still not looking at me. His words hung in the air, cold and strange. I didn't know what to say, so I just kept driving, hoping we'd reach some gas station or rest stop soon. A few miles later, I risked another glance at him, and my blood ran cold. His face had changed. I swear, his skin was now pale and gray, almost like the color had drained out of it. Dark circles ringed his hollow eyes, and his cheeks had sunken in, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. I wanted to say something, to ask if he was okay, but the words got caught in my throat. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried to focus on the road, but the eerie silence was pressing in on me, filling the cab like a thick fog. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of my eye, even though his head didn't move. After what felt like hours, he spoke again, barely louder than a whisper. "Why didn't you stop? Last tea time." I felt a chill go through me, colder than the night air. Last time? I'd never seen this guy before in my life. I cleared my throat, my voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" He didn't answer, but this time, he turned to look at me. His face was closer now, hollow and drawn, eyes sunken deep into his skull like something out of a nightmare. Those eyes held me in place, cold and endless, like they were pulling me in. I waited. "So long," he said, his voice echoing, distant. "I've been waiting here, waiting for someone to take me back." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept driving, hoping to see a sign, a gas station, anything to get me out of there. But the road stretched on, dark and empty, with no end in sight. Then he whispered, "Do you see them?" I looked where he was pointing, out into the trees. At first, I saw nothing. But then, faintly, I noticed shadows moving through the trees, figures drifting in and out of sight, all staring at me with hollow eyes, like they were waiting for something too. They looked like they were trying to get closer, inching forward, their faces empty and lifeless. I yanked my gaze back to the road, my hands trembling. I couldn't look at him, couldn't look at them. My mind raced, and I felt a cold sweat trickling down my back. Who are they?" I managed to choke out. He turned to face the road, silent again, and for a long moment he just watched the shadows. Then he leaned in close, so close I could feel the chill of his breath. "They're lost, just like me, looking for a way home." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What happened to you?" His lips curled into a faint, hollow smile. "They didn't stop for me, just like you almost did." And with that, he vanished. 1 second, he was sitting there, close enough that I could feel his cold breath. The next, he was gone, just gone, like he'd never been there at all. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a stop in the middle of the empty road. My heart was pounding, my head spinning, and I looked around, hoping, praying it had all been a nightmare. But the road was empty. No hitchhiker, no shadows, just the silent, dark stretch of highway, winding through the trees. I took a deep breath and looked in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the empty road stretching behind me. To this day, I don't know who or what I picked up that night. All I know is, every time I drive that route, I see those shadows moving through the trees, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of those hollow eyes, waiting by the side of the road,